Picture this. You're standing in your own driveway, hands shaking as you hold a certified letter that just arrived. The words blur together through your tears. But three phrases stand out like neon signs. Immediate foreclosure, proceedings, unpaid fines totaling $47,000, and you have 30 days. $47,000. For what? A garden gnome that was supposedly architecturally inappropriate. A mailbox that was painted the wrong shade of beige. Grass that grew half an inch too tall while I was caring for my dying mother. But here's the thing that made my blood boil while they were threatening to take my home. Our HOA board president was posting Instagram stories from a penthouse suite in Vegas, designer cocktails, high roller tables, and a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars, all funded by money that was supposed to fix our crumbling sidewalks and broken streetlights. That's when I realized this wasn't about maintaining property values. This was about greed, power, and systematic theft. And they picked the wrong person to mess with. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I took down the most corrupt HOA board in our county's history. Buckle up, because what happened next will make your blood boil, your heart race, and ultimately leave you cheering for justice. 3 years ago, my husband Mark and I thought we'd found paradise. Willowbrook Estates, a beautiful planned community with tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and the kind of neighborhood where kids could ride bikes safely and neighbors actually knew each other's names. We'd been renting a tiny apartment for 8 years, saving every penny for our dream home. Mark worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, and I picked up freelance graphic design work on weekends. Our daughter Emma was 7 then, and we wanted to give her the childhood we never had, a backyard for sleepovers, a good school district, and that elusive thing called community. When we first toured 1247 Maple Lane, I actually cried. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything was so right. The house had this beautiful bay window that Emma immediately claimed as her reading nook. The kitchen had enough space for Mark to experiment with his weekend cooking hobby. And the backyard. It was perfect for the vegetable garden I'd been dreaming about since we got married. The HOA fees seemed reasonable, $150 a month for maintaining common areas, landscaping, and community amenities like the playground and the small lake where residents could fish. The sales agent, Linda, walked us through the community guidelines with a warm smile. Nothing too restrictive, she assured us. Just basic standards to keep everyone's property values up. The board is made up of volunteers from the neighborhood, really nice people who just want to maintain our little slice of heaven. Our first year was exactly what we'd hoped for. Emma made friends immediately. Mrs. Chin next door brought us homemade dumplings and taught Emma how to fold them. The Johnsons across the street invited us to their 4th of July barbecue, where we met dozens of neighbors who became genuine friends. I started my vegetable garden that spring. Tomatoes, cucumbers, and Emma's favorite, sunflowers that grew taller than she was. Mark built a little greenhouse in the corner, and we spent weekends teaching Emma about composting and sustainable living. Life was good. Life was simple. The HOA board back then consisted of 5 retirees who'd lived in the community for years. They met once a month in the community center, discussed mundane things like when to schedule the annual tree trimming and whether to add more speed bumps. The meetings lasted an hour, max, and usually ended with coffee and cookies that Mrs. Patterson, the board secretary, would bring from home. But everything changed when Harold Brennan moved in. Harold was a real estate developer who'd made his fortune flipping houses and building strip malls. He was in his early 50s, drove a BMW that cost more than our annual household income, and had the kind of slick-back hair and permanent scowl that screamed, "I sue people for fun." At first, we barely noticed him. He kept to himself, rarely attended community events, and seemed content to live his life behind a massive privacy fence he'd immediately installed around his corner lot property. But 6 months later, during the annual HOA board elections, Harold threw his hat in the ring for president. His campaign was slick, professional flyers promising enhanced property values, strict adherence to community standards, and bringing Willowbrook Estates into the 21st century. The problem was, most of our neighbors didn't show up to vote. Out of 200 households, only 37 people came to the community center that rainy Tuesday evening in October. Harold won by a landslide, not because people loved his vision, but because most folks were home watching Netflix, assuming their votes didn't matter for something as small as a neighborhood HOA. That was our first mistake. We learned too late that every vote matters, especially when power-hungry people are counting on your apathy. Within 2 months of Harold taking over, everything began to change. The first sign of trouble came in December, just before Christmas. I was hanging lights on our front porch, the same warm white LED lights we'd used the previous year, when I found a violation notice tucked under our doormat. Architectural control violation, #1247001, unauthorized holiday. Decorations exceeding approved specifications. Fine $25. Please remedy within 48 hours or additional penalties will apply. I read it 3 times, convinced it was some kind of joke. Exceeding approved specifications? These were basic Christmas lights that half the neighborhood was using. I marched over to Harold's house, violation notice in hand, ready to clear up what had to be a misunderstanding. Harold answered the door in a silk bathrobe, looking annoyed that someone had dared to interrupt his evening. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if he'd never seen me before in his life. "Hi, Harold. I'm Sarah from Maple Lane. I think there's been a mistake with this violation notice." "No mistake," he interrupted, not even glancing at the paper. "The new holiday decoration guidelines were sent to all residents last month. Warm white lights only, no more than 150 feet of lighting per property, and absolutely no inflatables or animated displays." "But Harold, these are warm white lights, and I only used maybe 100 feet. "The color temperature is wrong," he said, pulling out his phone and shining its flashlight on my lights. "Those are 3,000 K. The approved specification is 2,700 K. You'll need to replace them or face escalating fines." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. He was serious, dead serious, about the color temperature of Christmas lights that looked identical to the human eye. "Harold, this is ridiculous. No one can tell the difference between." "Ma'am, if you have an issue with a violation, you can appeal it at the next board meeting. January 15th, 7 p.m., Community Center. Until then, the fine stands and the violations need to be corrected." He closed the door in my face. That night, Mark and I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the violation notice like it was written in a foreign language. "Maybe we should just change the lights," Mark suggested. "It's $25, not worth the fight." But something in my gut told me this wasn't about Christmas lights. This was about control. This was about testing boundaries to see who would push back and who would just comply. I was right. The lights were just the beginning. January brought a new round of violations. Mrs. Chin got fined for her garden gnome, apparently. Decorative lawn ornaments now required prior approval from the Architectural Control Committee. The Johnsons got hit for parking their daughter's car on the street overnight when their garage door broke. The Hendersons were cited for letting their grass grow to 3.5 inches instead of the newly mandated maximum of 3 inches. But the violations weren't random. They followed a pattern. Longtime residents who'd lived here for years, who remembered the old board, who had established relationships and community ties, we were being targeted. Meanwhile, newer residents who kept to themselves seemed to avoid Harold's notice entirely. The February board meeting was my first time attending, and I'll never forget walking into that community center. What used to be a casual gathering with folding chairs in a circle had been transformed into something that looked like a corporate boardroom. Harold sat at a long table at the front, flanked by 4 new board members I'd never seen before. They all wore business suits. They all had matching folders. and they all had the same cold, professional demeanor that made you feel like you were facing a tribunal rather than your neighbors. Next on the agenda, Harold announced, not bothering to look up from his papers, violation appeals. Case number 1247001, Sarah Mitchell, Christmas. Lighting noncompliance. I stood up, my heart pounding. Hi everyone. I'm Sarah, and I think there's been a misunderstanding about my Christmas lights. They look identical to the approved lights, and I followed all the guidelines that were in place when we moved here. Ma'am, interrupted a woman to Harold's left who I later learned was his wife, Janet. The guidelines changed in November. All residents were notified via email and postal mail. I never received any email or mail about new guidelines, I said. Harold made a show of shuffling through his papers. Our records indicate notification was sent to all residents on November 15th via the contact information on file. If you fail to receive the notification, that suggests your contact information is outdated, which is itself a violation of Section 4.7 of the revised Community Guidelines. I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone. Harold, you literally just made up that section number, and I never got any notification because you never sent one. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to watch your tone, Janet said. Accusations and disrespectful behavior toward board members will not be tolerated. I'm not being disrespectful. I'm trying to understand why I'm being fined for Christmas lights that are identical to what I used last year. The appeal is denied, Harold said, stamping something in his folder. The fine stands, plus an additional $25 late fee since the violation has not been corrected. Next case. I left that meeting shaking with anger and disbelief. But I wasn't the only one. Outside in the parking lot, I found Mrs. Chun crying in her car. The Hendersons were standing by their truck, looking shell-shocked. One by one, other residents approached us, sharing their own horror stories from the meeting. That's when I learned about the scope of what was happening. Harold hadn't just changed a few rules. He'd completely rewritten the community guidelines, expanding them from a 12-page document to a 47-page legal manual that regulated everything from the acceptable colors for house trim to the specific breeds of dogs allowed in the community. More troubling, the fees and fines had skyrocketed. What used to be $5 warnings for minor violations were now $25, fines that doubled every month they went unpaid. New categories of violations had been created for things that had never been issues before, like visual pollution, having your garbage cans visible from the street, and community aesthetic disruption, essentially anything the board didn't like. But the worst part was the enforcement. Harold had hired a property management company called Premier Community Services to conduct weekly inspections of every property in the neighborhood. These weren't friendly reminders from neighbors. These were professional inspectors with cameras and measuring devices who treated our homes like crime scenes. I started getting violation notices weekly. My mailbox post was half an inch too far from the curb. My garden hose, coiled neatly beside my garage, was considered storage equipment that violated the clean sight line regulation. The small bird feeder Emma had hung from our oak tree was an unauthorized structure that required architectural approval. Each violation came with a $25 fine that doubled if not remedied within 7 days. But here's the catch. The violations were often for things that were impossible to fix quickly or that required expensive modifications. Moving a mailbox requires calling the utility companies to make sure you don't hit underground lines. That takes weeks and costs hundreds of dollars. But Harold's board expected it done in 7 days, or the fine doubled to $50, then $100, then $200. By April, our monthly HOA bill had gone from $150 to nearly $800, and we weren't alone. The Chens were facing over $2,000 in accumulated fines. The Hendersons had received a foreclosure warning for $3,500 in unpaid violations. That's when I decided to dig deeper into what Harold was actually doing with all this money. I started by requesting financial records, which should have been available to all homeowners according to state law. Harold's response was a 14-page letter explaining why the records were proprietary information that could only be released with a formal legal request that would cost me $500 in administrative fees. So I filed a formal complaint with the county, requesting an investigation into our HOA's financial practices. 3 weeks later, I received a call from investigator Maria Santos at the county clerk's office. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "I've reviewed your complaint, and I have to tell you, what you're describing is highly unusual. Most HOA disputes are about petty neighbor disagreements. This sounds like something much more serious." Maria agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop near the county courthouse. She was a small woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every type of fraud imaginable. "Tell me about the board," she said, pulling out a notebook. "How long has this Harold Brennan been in charge?" I walked her through everything: the sudden rule changes, the excessive fines, the professional management company, the refusal to provide financial records. Maria took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made it clear she understood exactly what was happening. "Sarah," she said when I finished, "I've investigated dozens of HOA fraud cases. What you're describing fits a very specific pattern. It's called fine farming. Artificially inflating violation enforcement to generate revenue that gets diverted to board members or their associates." My stomach dropped. Diverted how? Usually through inflated contracts with companies the board members have financial interests in. Like this Premier Community Services, I'd bet money that Harold either owns that company or gets kickbacks from them. Same with any construction or maintenance work being done in the community. She was right. Over the past 6 months, Harold had hired Premier Community Services for violation enforcement, Brennan Landscaping for tree trimming, and B&H Property Maintenance for sidewalk repairs, all at prices that seemed astronomical for the work being done. "The Vegas trip you mentioned," Maria continued. "When did that happen?" "Last month. Harold and his wife, plus the other 4 board members. They posted pictures all over social media. Looked like they dropped serious money." Maria nodded grimly. "That's the smoking gun. HOA boards can't use community funds for personal entertainment, period. If I can prove they used homeowner money for that trip, it's felony embezzlement." For the first time in months, I felt hope. But Maria's next words brought me back to reality. "Here's the problem, Sarah. These investigations take time, sometimes years. And while we're building a case, Harold's board can continue what they're doing. They can even accelerate it if they feel threatened. How much are you into them?" "For right now," I did the math in my head, "about $1,200 in fines and late fees. That'll probably triple before we can shut them down. And if it hits a certain threshold, they can actually begin foreclosure proceedings on your house." The room started spinning. "They can take our house? Over Christmas lights and garden hoses?" "Legally, yes. If unpaid HOA fines exceed a certain amount, usually around $10,000, they can place a lien on your property and eventually foreclose. It's rare, but it happens." I thought about Emma, about Mark working double shifts to afford our mortgage, about the vegetable garden and the reading nook and everything we'd sacrificed to build our life here. I thought about Mrs. Chun crying in her car and the Hendersons' shell-shocked faces. That's when something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped into place. Like a puzzle piece finding its proper position. "Maria," I said, "what would you need to expedite this investigation?" Maria Santos became my partner in what we started calling Operation Willowbrook. She explained that while the county investigation would take time, there were things I could do immediately to gather evidence and protect my neighbors. "First," she said, "document everything. Every violation notice, every communication, every fee. Take photos, save emails, Record phone calls if your state allows it. We need to establish a pattern of abuse. Second, rally your neighbors. The more residents who file complaints, the stronger our case becomes. And the more people who understand what's happening, the harder it becomes for Harold to operate in secret. Third, attend every board meeting. Ask hard questions. Force them to explain their decisions on the record. Most fraud relies on people not paying attention. I left that coffee shop feeling like I had a mission. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting to Harold's attacks, I was going on the offense. I started with the documentation. I created a spreadsheet tracking every violation. Notice our household had received, cross-referencing them with photos of our property and the specific regulations being cited. The pattern became clear. Immediately, Harold's board was making up violations that didn't exist or citing regulations that had been changed retroactively. For example, they'd find us for excessive lawn ornamentation because of a small decorative stone border around Emma's sunflowers. But when I looked up the regulation they cited, it had been added to the community guidelines too. Weeks after they issued the violation, they were literally creating rules to justify fines they'd already imposed. Next, I reached out to neighbors. Mrs. Chun was my first ally. She'd been keeping her own records and was eager to share them. Together, we discovered that the Brennan Board had issued over 400 violation notices in their first 6 months, compared to fewer than 50 in the entire previous year. The Hendersons, the Johnsons, the Patels, the Kowalskis, one by one, residents, began sharing their stories. Everyone had multiple violations. Everyone was facing escalating fines. And everyone felt helpless and alone until we started talking to each other. We decided to organize a neighborhood meeting, not an official HOA meeting, but a gathering where residents could share information and coordinate our response. I reserved the community center for a Saturday morning, officially, listing it as a book club meeting to avoid interference from Harold's board. 23 households showed up. People brought coffee and pastries, and what started as a grim discussion of our collective problems gradually transformed into something more powerful, a community coming together to protect itself. We need to understand their finances, said Jim Henderson, who worked as an accountant. If they're embezzling money, there will be traces in the books. We just need to know where to look. My cousin is a lawyer, offered Maria Patel. She specializes in HOA law. Maybe she can advise us on our legal options. Mrs. Chun, who'd been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. In my country, when the government becomes corrupt, the people remove them. Can we not do the same here? That's when I realized we had been thinking about this all wrong. We'd been treating Harold's board like they were legitimate authorities we had to negotiate with or petition. But they weren't. They were volunteers who served at the pleasure of the homeowners. We had the power to remove them. We just had to use it. Mrs. Chun is right, I said. We can call a special election to remove the entire board and replace them with people who actually represent our interests. Jim pulled out his copy of the community guidelines, the original 12-page version, from before Harold's changes. According to Section 12, any group of homeowners representing 20% of the community can petition for a special election. That's 40 households. We've got 23 here, I said, looking around the room. We need 17 more. I can get 5 households on Elm Street, said Janet Johnson. The new families on Birch Avenue are fed up too, added Dr. Patel. That's another 6 or 7. By the end of that meeting, we had commitments from 43 households, more than enough to force a special election. But calling an election was just the first step. We needed candidates to run, and, more importantly, we needed to ensure that every pro-community resident in Willowbrook showed up to vote. We'd learned our lesson from Harold's initial election. Apathy was the enemy of democracy. I volunteered to run for president, despite having 0 experience with HOA governance. Mrs. Chin agreed to run for secretary. Jim Henderson would handle the treasurer position. The Johnsons and Dr. Patel rounded out our slate. Our campaign strategy was simple: transparency, accountability, and returning to the original community vision that had attracted us all to Willowbrook in the first place. We printed flyers explaining exactly how much money Harold's board had extracted from residents and fines, how those funds were being spent, and what we planned to do differently. We organized door-to-door canvassing, hosted information sessions, and created a simple website where residents could track violation notices and see patterns in enforcement. But Harold wasn't going to give up without a fight. 3 days after we submitted our petition for a special election, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just another violation notice. It was a legal demand for immediate payment of $8,750 in accumulated fines and fees, plus a warning that failure to pay within 10 days would result in foreclosure proceedings against our home. $8,750 for Christmas lights, garden hoses, and grass that was allegedly too tall. I called Maria Santos immediately. "They're accelerating," she said. "This is what I was afraid of. They know you're organizing against them, so they're trying to crush you financially before the election." Can they actually foreclose over this? Technically, yes. But the good news is that this kind of aggressive escalation often works in our favor for the criminal investigation. They're getting desperate, which means they're going to make mistakes. That night, Mark and I sat in our kitchen, staring at the foreclosure notice. Emma was upstairs doing homework, blissfully unaware that we might lose the house she'd grown up in. "Maybe we should just pay it," Mark said quietly. "Take out a loan, pay the fines. Keep our heads down until the election." I understood his fear. Mark had grown up in poverty, moving from apartment to apartment when his single mother couldn't make rent. The idea of losing our home triggered every anxiety he'd carried since childhood. But I thought about Mrs. Chun, who was facing similar threats, about the Hendersons, who'd already taken out a second mortgage to pay Harold's escalating fines, about all the families who didn't have the resources to fight back. "No," I said. "If we pay this, we're not just enabling Harold, we're abandoning everyone else who's counting on us. We're going to fight this thing all the way." The next morning, I did something that terrified me. I called the local newspaper. Jennifer Walsh from the Tribune was exactly the kind of investigative journalist you hope exists but rarely encounter. She'd been covering municipal corruption for 15 years and had a reputation for taking down local officials who abused their power. HOA fraud is actually more common than people think, she told me over the phone. But residents usually don't organize like you have. Most people just pay the fines and move on. This Harold Brennan character sounds like he's gotten greedy and careless. Jennifer agreed to meet with our group and investigate Harold's board. She brought a photographer and spent 3 hours interviewing residents, reviewing violation notices, and documenting the extent of the fine farming operation. But her most important contribution was connecting us with David Chun, Mrs. Chen's nephew, who happened to be a forensic accountant specializing in embezzlement cases. David volunteered to analyze Harold's financial dealings pro bono, using public records and the limited financial information we'd been able to gather. What he found was even worse than we'd suspected. "This isn't just fine farming," David explained at our next neighborhood meeting. "This is a comprehensive embezzlement scheme involving multiple shell companies and kickback arrangements." He'd created a detailed chart showing the money flow. Premier Community Services, the violation enforcement company, was owned by Janet Brennan, Harold's wife. Brennan Landscaping was Harold's cousin's business. B&H Property Maintenance was a shell company that existed only on paper, with its business address matching Harold's office building downtown. "In the past 8 months," David continued, "your HOA has paid out over $150,000 to these 3 companies for services that should have cost maybe $30,000. The excess is pure profit going directly into the Brennan family's pockets." But the smoking gun was the Vegas trip. David had obtained credit card records through a contact at the bank, showing that the HOA's business account had been used to pay for flights, hotels, meals, and even gambling losses for all 5 board members and their spouses. "This is felony embezzlement," David said. "We're talking about potential prison time." Jennifer's article ran on the front page of the Sunday Tribune with the headline, "Willowbrook HOA Board accused of embezzling thousands for Vegas trip." The story included photos of Harold's Instagram posts from Vegas alongside images of our crumbling sidewalks and broken streetlights that should have been fixed with community funds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Our phones rang constantly with calls from other journalists, lawyers offering to help, and residents from other communities sharing similar stories. The county prosecutor's office announced they were opening a criminal investigation based on Jennifer's reporting and our documentation. But most importantly, Willowbrook residents finally understood the scope of what had been happening. The article had been shared hundreds of times on social media, and suddenly neighbors who'd been isolated and intimidated realized they weren't alone. Harold's response was predictable. He doubled down at an emergency board meeting called 3 days after the article ran. He announced that all residents who had participated in defamatory media coverage would face additional fines for bringing disrepute to the community. That was his fatal mistake. The meeting was packed, not just with our core group of organizers, but with dozens of residents who'd never attended a board meeting before. People were angry, and Harold's attempt to intimidate them only made it worse. "You have no authority to fine residents for talking to journalists," I said, standing up in the back of the room. "That's a violation of the First Amendment, and it's exactly the kind of abuse that proves you're unfit to govern this community." "Sit down, Mrs. Mitchell," Harold snapped. "You're out of order." "No, Harold, you're out of order. You've been out of order since the day you decided to treat our neighborhood like your personal ATM." The room erupted in applause. Other residents stood up, voicing their own grievances, sharing their stories, demanding answers. Harold tried to maintain control, banging his gavel and threatening to have people removed, but it was clear he'd lost any semblance of authority. That's when Mrs. Chun stood up, all 4 feet 10 inches of her, wearing the same floral dress she wore to every community event. The room went quiet. "Mr. Brennan," she said in her soft voice that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "I came to this country 40 years ago with nothing. I worked 3 jobs to buy my house. I raised my children here. I buried my husband in the cemetery down the road. This is my home." Her voice got stronger. "You think you can scare me with your fines and your lawyers and your threats? You think I will let you steal from my neighbors and destroy my community? You are wrong." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick folder. "I have every violation notice, every fine, every threatening letter you have sent to residents in this neighborhood. I have given copies to the police, to the county prosecutor, and to 3 different newspapers." Harold's face had gone pale. "Mrs. Chun, you don't understand the legal implications." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You are a thief, and thieves belong in jail." The room exploded in applause again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just anger, it was celebration. The spell had been broken. Harold's authority had evaporated completely. The special election was held 2 weeks later. We organized carpools to make sure every eligible voter could participate. We set up childcare at the community center. We even arranged for translation services for our Spanish-speaking residents. The turnout was unprecedented. 187 of 200 households voted. Our reform slate won by margins that would make any politician jealous. I received 178 votes for president. Harold got 9. But our victory at the ballot box was just the beginning. The real satisfaction came 6 weeks later, when county sheriff's deputies arrived at Harold's house with arrest warrants. Harold, Janet, and the other 3 board members were charged with multiple felonies, embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The total amount stolen was eventually calculated at over $200,000, money that should have gone to community improvements but instead funded luxury vacations, expensive cars, and home renovations for the Brennan family. The local media covered every development in the case. Harold's mugshot appeared on the evening news alongside photos of his Vegas Instagram posts. The contrast was stark: a bloated, entitled man in an orange jumpsuit versus the images of wealth and excess he'd flaunted while stealing from his neighbors. Today, 3 years later, Willowbrook Estates is unrecognizable from the community Harold tried to create through fear and financial intimidation. Our first act as the new board was to dismiss all outstanding violation fines and refund money that residents had already paid. We returned to the original 12-page community guidelines, focusing on genuine safety and property maintenance, rather than arbitrary aesthetic control. We hired a legitimate property management company that conducts quarterly inspections focused on real issues like drainage problems and safety hazards. Violation notices are rare, and when they're issued, they come with offers to help. Homeowners address the problems rather than threats of escalating fines. The money we recovered through the criminal case, along with funds that had been sitting in Harold's inflated reserve accounts, allowed us to make real improvements to our community. We repaved the roads, fixed the broken streetlights, and installed a new playground that Emma and her friends helped design. But the most important change isn't visible in our improved infrastructure or our reasonable fees. It's in the relationships between neighbors, the sense of collective ownership and responsibility that Harold tried to destroy through division and intimidation. Mrs. Chin still tends her garden, but now she hosts monthly workshops teaching other residents about sustainable gardening and composting. Her garden gnome sits proudly in her front yard, surrounded by vegetables that she shares freely with anyone who wants them. The Hendersons started a neighborhood watch program that's actually about community safety rather than violation enforcement. The Johnsons organize regular block parties that bring together families from across the community. As for Harold and his cronies, they're serving sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years in state prison. Harold himself received the maximum sentence, 5 years, partly because he showed no remorse and continued to insist he'd done nothing wrong even after his conviction. But justice wasn't just about seeing Harold behind bars. It was about reclaiming our community and proving that ordinary people can stand up to corruption and win when they work together. I still get calls from residents in other communities facing similar situations. HOA fraud is more common than most people realize, and it thrives on the same combination of homeowner apathy and unchecked authority that allowed Harold to operate for so long. My advice is always the same: document everything, organize your neighbors, and never underestimate the power of transparency. Most HOA abuse relies on residents not paying attention or not understanding their rights. When communities engage and hold their boards accountable, corruption becomes much harder to sustain. Emma is 11 now, and she doesn't remember much about the Harold era, beyond the vague sense that there was a time when people in our neighborhood seemed stressed and angry. She's grown up in a community where neighbors help each other, where kids play freely in the streets, and where the adults around her model the kind of civic engagement that makes democracy work. That might be Harold's most lasting defeat. He intended to create a community based on fear, compliance, and individual isolation. Instead, his abuse brought us together and taught us the value of collective action and mutual support. Last month, Emma asked me why I keep Harold's old violation notices in a file cabinet in our home office. I told her they're a reminder that democracy requires constant vigilance, that power corrupts when it goes unchecked, and that ordinary people have more strength than they realize when they stand together. Some people might think it's petty to hold onto those reminders of a difficult time, but I disagree. Those violation notices represent more than Harold's greed. They represent a test that our community passed. They prove that corruption can be defeated, that justice is possible, and that the American dream of homeownership doesn't have to come with a side of tyranny. Willowbrook Estates is our home. We earned it, we fought for it, and we'll protect it from anyone who tries to exploit our neighbors or destroy our community. That's a promise I can make because I've seen what we're capable of when we work together. And Harold, he's learning that karma doesn't just hit hard, it hits with the full force of a community that refuses to be intimidated, silenced, or stolen from. Our gardens are growing, our children are thriving, and our HOA fees are $150 a month, just like they should be. Sometimes, justice isn't just served. It's planted, cultivated, and allowed to flourish for everyone to see.